Hi guys, today we're going to talk about the NARD 26 rudiments, or actually more specifically, rudiments that are not on the NARD 26, but that could have been. And by that I mean rudiments held in high regard, taught, published, and played by the founding members of NARD, or at least some of them, that didn't end up making the 26. So a little bit of history here. If you're not familiar with the NARD rudiments, the National Association of Rudimental Drummers had 13 founding members, and in 1933 they came up with 13 original standardized rudiments from a pool of many, many more American rudiments that they could have selected from. A little bit later they came up with another 13, and you add those together and you get 26. All 26 are currently also found on our Percussive Arts Society 40 rudiment sheets, and we just added 14 more in the 80s. But so for about 50 years, these were the standard American rudiments for the teaching and learning of drums and for the performance of rudimental repertoire. Now, a lot of people have become canonically, religiously, fanatically obsessed with these 26 over the past 80 or 90 years. A lot of people are NARD members, a lot of people are not NARD members and just happen to learn these rudiments from their teacher or whatever. And I've had people tell me that no other rudiments beside the 26 are real, that the 26 are the original rudiments of drumming of all time, that NARD invented the rudiments or even the concept of rudiments. And none of these statements is true, but people fanatically and really deep down believe in this, and they're really anti any other rudiments. Even the 14 added to the PAS 40, I've had people tell me are fake, made up, not real. And it's kind of ridiculous, but these people exist. So I thought to combat that, we would look at what the actual NARD founders thought about their own 26 rudiment list, and also other rudiments that aren't on the list. Now, to do that, we can't really go talk to these people because I don't think any of them are with us anymore. I mean, these guys were adult drum teachers in the 1930s, which means most of them were born in the 1800s. They didn't make it this far. So how are we going to do this? Well, at least 4 of the members have published 1 or more books with rudimental instruction in them in their lifetimes. And so we can look at their publications and see what rudiments exist and what rudiments don't exist, and get an idea of what each teacher individually thought was important. Because we have to remember, the 26 rudiments that we got on our NARD sheets, they're the lowest common denominator. They're just the rudiments that the whole group could agree on. They're not every rudiment that each individual thought was maybe important enough to teach, play, publish, and generally use and hold in high regard. So who were these 13 founding members? Well, if we look at the list, we have Harry Thompson, George A. Robinson, Bill Flowers, Bill Kiefer, Bill Hammond, yeah, there are a lot of Bills, Joe Hathaway, Larry Stone, Roy Knapp, William Ludwig, who could also be called Bill, Heine Gerlach, J. Burns Moore, Bill Lee Miller, and Ed Strait. I mean, seriously, a lot of Bills here. Some of these guys are fairly famous, names you've probably heard before, some of them maybe not so much. The 4 guys who we're interested in, who have books we can actually look at today, William Ludwig of the Ludwig Drum Company, J. Burns Moore, Ed Strait, and George Lawrence Stone of stick control fame. So you've heard of at least Ludwig and Stone, I'm sure, if you play drums at all. So one would assume that these guys, whose names are inexorably linked to the 26 rudiments, they're founding members of the organization that published the 26 rudiments, they were there when the rudiments were compiled and selected. They would just adhere to these, right? You would think that they would teach them, they would publish them, they would promote them for the sake of their organization that they helped create, right? Well, not exactly. So as it turns out, all these guys had at least one rudiment in their books that was not part of the 26. It wasn't canonical. It wasn't one of the agreed upon standard rudiments. It was a non-standard additional selection. Some of them also had their own sort of non-standard naming conventions that are typically derived from an older source or just were a general alternative name for rudiments that do exist on the NARD sheet. Even though they helped decide the sheet, they couldn't let go of the name they were used to calling the rudiment. So these guys really weren't a unified block in support of these 26. They all had their own pet rudiments and naming conventions that they really just couldn't help but slide into their publication. So these were only 4 of 13 guys, but they're the only 4 that have books, and it's all 4 of the ones who have books. So you can extrapolate that every single founding member probably had a few rudiments in their back pocket that they really didn't want to let go of, even though it didn't make the final cut. Great, so we have these guys who just won't let go of certain rudiments, but what rudiments are we talking about? I'm going to go through each author and point out the rudiments in their books that weren't NARD 26 standards. The first guy we'll talk about is J. Burns Moore and his Art of Drumming from 1937. It was published with William Ludwig's WFL Drum Company. They also published books at that time. This guy may have been the best drummer on this list. He won tons of championships, was extremely highly regarded in his day, and he had the standard NARD 26 listed out in his book, as you would expect, but he also couldn't help himself from including the triple paradiddle, which I think he's the first person to ever publish the triple paradiddle, at least that I've ever seen, and I've looked at a lot of drum books. Next, we'll talk about William Ludwig, of course. He had several books that he published in his lifetime. The most rudimentally oriented and the one that includes the most rudimental instruction in a general sense is his Complete Instructor from 1942. So, of course, well after the Nard Rudiments had taken hold. And he actually had 31 rudiments in that book. Again, like Moore, he listed out the 26 standard rudiments very judiciously by number, but he also included these 5 other ones, and they just didn't have a number. They were sprinkled throughout. They weren't even tacked on to the end. A lot of the time they were just interspersed with the other 26, and they include the 3-stroke rough, the 4-stroke rough, the 6-stroke roll, the triple paradiddle, which he probably got from Moore, because of course he published Moore's book, and then the flam accent number 2. None of these were really new at this point. They'd all been published somewhere before, but he, of course, decided they were important enough to include in addition to the 26 from the Nard sheet. So the next guy you've also probably heard of, George Lawrence Stone, of stick control fame, of course, as we mentioned. In 1931, he actually published a book a couple years before the Nard Rudiments were decided, and it was called Military Drum Beats, and it listed the Stroob lessons from 1869. With an asterisk, he included the single-stroke roll, which wasn't really a lesson on its own in the Stroob book, but weirdly, these were exactly the 26 rudiments that ended up being the Nard Rudiments. So I'm not sure how collaborative that process really was if Stone's list that he basically took from Stroob became the exact rudiments of the Nard list a couple years later. Anyway, maybe it's just a coincidence of some sort. I'm not really sure. Stroob was really highly regarded in this era by a lot of people. But that being said, those were the 26 he included in the rudiments section. He also included a 17-stroke roll explicitly numbered and named in some of the beats in his military drum beats, which wasn't that usual. He may have been the first person to actually number out a half-note roll as a 17-stroke roll, but he didn't consider it quote-unquote a rudiment because it wasn't part of the Stroob rudiments. In stick control, he also includes a rudiment that's not on the 26. He calls it a 3-stroke roll, which I assume is probably like a drag or a rough. I'm not exactly sure what he means by that, but that's either a term that's not standard to the sheet or a rudiment that doesn't exist on the sheet. So even a guy who was really adamantly for the Stroob rudiments that eventually became the Nard Rudiments, he had 2 other rudiments listed in his books. So the last guy is probably maybe the most interesting guy in a way. Edward B. Strait. He was one of the first guys to write books for the drum set. I don't know that he was the first. He could have been, though. He called it double drumming at that time, playing bass drum and snare drum at the same time by way of a pedal, of course, which is what we would conceive of as being drum set playing. But he started publishing books in the very early 1900s or potentially even the late 1800s. Anyway, the book that has the most rudimental content was his 1936 drum corps method, which I think was the last book he published, and of course it was after the Nard sheets came out. And in this book, he only has 14 rudiments, so he decided that the other part of the 26 was just not relevant, even though the book was specifically for drum corps, which is a very rudimental enterprise. Of those 14, 4 of them were either named in a funny non-standard way or were just not on the Nard sheet. So realistically, we're only looking at 10 rudiments from the Nard list that he deemed worthy of including verbatim in his book. And then he had these other 4 weird ones. So those include the 17-stroke roll like Stone, The tap flam, which is not really an inverted flam tap, but it's just a flam tap starting on the tap. The sticking was still a regular flam tap. The flamadiddle, which is a flam paradiddle, but he used a really old school name for it. And the drag, which is probably the same as the rough, but he used the word drag, which we use now, but was not what the Nard sheet used. If you think that you probably have never heard of Ed Strait, you might be wrong. If you've ever heard of straight sticking or natural sticking, he's the guy who came up with that. That's the one where you start every measure on the right hand instead of purely alternating or purely playing rudimental stickings. He's the guy who came up with starting the measure on the right, which is how a lot of sort of elementary, band methods teach sticking. To recap, the 10 rudiments that I've mentioned that aren't on the Nard 26 standard sheets that these guys felt were important enough to include in their books were the 3-stroke rough, the 3-stroke roll, the drag, the 4-stroke rough, the 6-stroke roll, the 17-stroke roll, the triple paradiddle, the flam accent number 2, which is sort of a flam tap in a shuffle rhythm, the tap flam, and the flam paradiddle. And here we've reached the so what moment. Why do we care? Well, I'm not trying to invalidate or diminish the importance of the 26 rudiments on the sheets. In fact, I teach them to all my students because they're included in the PAS 40, which I make every one of my students learn eventually. The point, though, is that these guys were unwilling to limit themselves to the 26. These 4 guys, and probably all the other founders too, recognized that the 26 was a jumping off point. It was a standard beginning, but it wasn't the end. There were rudiments that came before, there were rudiments that could be invented after. All the things that came before were helpful in getting to where they were at that time, and creating new things was a way to get to where we were all collectively, percussively going in the future. And that's the way it should be. Don't limit yourself to what just appeared on an old sheet, and don't take everything at face value. Be creative. Music is an art form, and so the more we can create, the wider range of influences we take in, the better we'll all be. Let me know if you have questions or comments. Thanks for watching. See you guys next time.